Political Capital is brought to you by Uber Canada. Learn more at uber.com/flexibilityworks.
CHEK Podcasts.
Hey everyone, and welcome to Political Capital, your source for all the latest in BC politics. I'm your host, Rob Shaw, coming to you from the CHEK News World Headquarters in Victoria. The BC government appealing a court ruling on its open drug use law, some new overdose numbers, another record there, and a cap on international students, plus a member of BC United exits on the eve of an election. We got a lot to cover this week. If you're watching us on CHEK TV or YouTube, hi. And also make sure you subscribe to the audio podcast for extra content. Let's bring in the pod squad, break everything down. Ali Blades, Jillian Oliver, Jeff Ferrier, thank you for being here. As usual, we're going to dive right into what I think is the big topic this week, and we have talked about it on many shows now, and it's got many branches, but another update on our overdose crisis numbers. 2023, a record year of deaths. After everything we've done, all the conversations, week after week, press conference after press conference, 2,511 people died, almost 7 per day. This toxic drug crisis remains one of the leading causes of deaths in the province. So amidst that backdrop, we have the chief coroner, Lisa Lapointe, holding her last press conference before retiring. She reiterates her call for the government to drop the requirement of a prescription to obtain safe supply, clean medical grade opioid alternatives, saying lots of people don't have doctors, they can't get access to it. The premier says no, drugs are dangerous. If we're going to give them out to people, they need medical supervision. Let's start there. That rift, it's been going for a while, but right up until the coroner leaves and these record numbers worsening between the coroner and the NDP government. Ali, what do you make of that?
So the chief coroner and the NDP government truly have been on opposing sides of theories to fix this crisis for a very long time. That's not a shock. Her departure in her last press conference very much solidifies that even more so. But I want to get back down to what this is, and it is a crisis. And so we do a lot of research on the show, and we read a lot of articles, and we try to expand our mindset on these things that we're trying to build opinions on. And it seems like every week that we're talking about it, I learn more and more. And so I'd like to challenge everyone to do their very own research, but I continue to lead down this path of treatment first. And there's a lot of information out there to support that. And even doctors are saying it's treatment first. And so in this, though, I want to deviate a little bit from your question, Rob, in that I see something happening potentially in the future with a new not in my backyard issue. Essentially, if we want to push treatment, if those who are announcing treatment beds like the NDP government, and we want them more in more communities, and we want them more accessible. And thanks to the NDP government for making them more accessible and free and available. I think there's going to be an issue leading into the provincial election where treatment options and spaces for this are going to be opposed by municipalities. And so when we talk about like destigmatizing this crisis, again, it's a crisis. When we talk about destigmatizing it, I want to make sure that we're all challenged in understanding that in order to get those treatment beds, we also have to be open to the fact that they have to go somewhere, and they have to go into those North Vancouver suburbs and those Coquitlam suburbs and into interior communities. And so if you're going to then oppose these treatment options in places where we need them, the government's not going to be able to do what they need to do and get more beds available. So all of this to say, I think we have a little bit of a growing problem. We're already starting to see a little bit of that. But I think this is going to get a whole lot worse.
It's a great point, because you'll hear the same argument that we hear in the housing debate when it comes to locating treatment or outpatient kind of services here. Well, I'm not against treatment, just not here. Just not in my community. You shouldn't put those beds or those shelter spaces or whatever. And And you're right, it does lead to that kind of problem. And then we have municipalities saying, well, we're not opposed to overdose prevention sites or supervised consumption sites or treatment sites, but they need wraparound support, 24/7 services, medical services, security services, things that may or may not even be logistically feasible and end up opposing the end result as well. So the point being, and I think Ali raises it quite well, Jeff, there's a lot of problems in any response to this crisis, and you have all sorts of people with different ideas on what to do, and it's hard to turn it into a reality.
Yeah, that's true. And I think you heard from the coroner that she was expressing her frustration that she wasn't able to make her idea a reality. And so there's been a lot of folks asking, well, why not make drugs more freely available to folks absent medical supervision? And I think it's because the coroner and folks who are in that line of thinking haven't effectively made a case to the public that doing that is going to do more good than it's going to do harm. And I heard the premier this week settle on where I think the majority of the public is that doctors prescribe and monitor folks who are getting safe supply. That this ensures that people will be kept alive and helped and offered treatment in those places. Like Ali notes, that we need to be expanding and expanding in every community and corner of British Columbia, because that's where the need is. You also have to keep hard drugs out of the hands of those who ought not to have them in the first place. And that's important to preventing people being stricken with addiction. So the numbers are troubling. It seems intractable. It's in BC, but it's everywhere. It's everywhere. There's poison in the drugs everywhere, and it's killing people everywhere. BC and next door in Alberta, taking a very different approach from a good place, but taking a very different approach. And they had the worst year for drug overdose, on par with BC last year. So we need to be doing what Ali said. More treatment beds available on demand, and it's got to be everywhere.
But the problem with treatment beds, and Gillian, let's bring you in here on this, and the Premier did respond to the record overdose numbers the next day with record treatment beds, 180, some of them are private, becoming public, some of them will open in the summer. We don't even know how many treatment beds we need. We don't know, and the coroner made this clear, we don't know how many we need, we don't know how we use the ones we have, we don't know the wait list, we don't know the outcomes, we don't have a clue. It's like blindfolding somebody and they're shoveling pennies down a well. We have no idea how deep the well is or if we're even making a difference with these beds. And so there's that issue as well, that even when we see the progress on numbers, what does it mean? They're just numbers. What do you think, Gillian?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think when it comes to treating addiction, there's no one size fits all. It's a very individualized, personal experience that people go through, and the same thing isn't going to work for every person. On top of that, I think, the coroner highlighted there's about 100,000 people in BC with an opioid substance disorder, and then another 150,000 people who are using drugs that might not fit the sort of criteria for a full substance use disorder. So people using recreationally or occasionally. So, even if we are able to scale up treatment massively, it's not going to totally address the problem, and we're still going to see these deaths. I think, with respect to her call for a safe supply, that comes from the death panel released late last year that included not just her, but members of all of the health authorities, or almost all of them, certainly the Vancouver Coastal Health and Fraser Health Authority, as well as law enforcement and, addiction specialists from the leading hospitals across the province. And I think reading that report, you really sense the desperation of so much thinking and effort being poured into this issue, and the numbers still continuing to get worse. One thing they really highlighted is that that's not because of decriminalization or safe supply. It's because it's a moving target, because the supply of illicit drugs is getting increasingly more toxic and more dangerous. So it's a really, really tough problem to get on top of, especially when there are so many issues with distributing safe supply, because, when you're doing that through a prescribed model, that relies on doctors. We have a doctor shortage, 1 million people in BC without a family doctor. It's a really, really difficult problem to get ahead of. And I think that's sort of where the coroner is coming from with this sort of last ditch effort to push the policy forward, because it's sort of like the only thing she can think of that could possibly make a difference. And ultimately, it's the core function of her job is to take responsibility for these deaths and to provide any solution she can to reduce them. So I think that's where she's coming from. It's obviously, there's a huge gap between that policy and where the public's at. And I think that's where the government's coming from. But it's, I think that it's her job to state the facts and the evidence as she has them. And that's what she did.
That's safe supply. The other part of the main government response to this, outside of the treatment beds, is decrim, the decriminalization experiment. And the government announcing this week it is appealing the Supreme Court temporary injunction against its law to, in some ways, not quite recriminalize, but roll back decrim in public spaces, public places like bus shelters and parks and beaches, where the new law was intended to move people along if they were using openly there. Is that a surprising move at all, Jeff, the appeal? And what do you think government's trying to say with that appeal?
Not surprising at all. I think the government's trying to say that it hears the concerns of people who are seeing how decriminalization is rolling out, and they want to preserve decriminalization. So they want to address the negative unintended consequences in a way that's going to make the public confident in what the government's doing on that broader suite of issues that Jillian talked about, safe supply, safe injection sites, and the like. People shouldn't be using drugs at schools, parks, playgrounds, and beaches around kids. It's common sense. But let's also be clear that people also shouldn't be using drugs alone. That's a recipe for death. We know that. So what's needed, and what I know this government says it supports, what I would like to hear John Rustad and the Conservatives say is support for more well-resourced, well-run, safe injection sites where people are medically supervised, have access to supports, where they don't die in communities across BC. And I think if Rustad does that, I can see Falcon following suit. And then we get all parties on the right focused on where they need to be, which is saving lives instead of silly wedge politics on a matter of life and death.
But Rustad, and to bring back to Ali's point, Rustad and Falcon aren't inventing opposition to the safe consumption sites and overdose prevention sites that.
No, they're leveraging it for their political purposes.
But they're also repeating what many mayors and people are saying, that they become hotspots for crime and social disorder, and especially in downtown cores, make some streets feel unsafe for citizens. You can't go to certain areas without someone in the middle of a psychosis due to drugs.
They should be leaders and not parrots.
But I think bringing forward those concerns instead of pretending that they don't exist, Ali, to bring you in, is going to have to be part of what government has to do, right? They have to build some type of case to put these in. They can't just throw the sites in and then say, if you complain about someone running up to you and screaming in front of your family or being in medical distress, that you're not seeing it. It's not okay to say that that's happening, and the government needs to do better to deal with that.
We're not going to get it right off the bat, because this is a crisis. There's just way too much going on, right? But I'll applaud the NDP government, because they have pivoted to a space where they realized, okay, decriminalization may not be that solution, so we're going to change our minds. That's okay. That's actually great when politicians do that, because they're taking evidence that this experiment isn't working and fix it. That's what governments are supposed to do. They're supposed to fix it. One of the issues, though, that Lapointe was having was her criticism that this has become hyper politicized. And essentially, this is the conversation that we're having right now. I think every political party has had an opinion about this. BC United came out with a comprehensive plan of better is possible right out of the gate. Typically, you wouldn't see this from a political party in an election year. They'd hold on to it closer to an election so that they're not giving away their trade secrets, right? The BC Conservatives have a very successful petition right now of, I think they're getting close to 5,000 signatures from across the province aiming to end safe supply. And so essentially what I'm trying to say here is that everyone needs to have an opinion. We all need to understand what each political party, where their stance is on this, because this is a big issue leading into a provincial election. But it's okay if we change our mind because people's lives are at stake here. And so maybe LaPointe is right. This has become too politicized, and we will just recalibrate as we go.
Oregon changing its mind as well, legislation, a new bill this week, and it was the first U.S. state to go with decrim in 2020, recriminalizing, saying that if you are arrested or threatened with arrest and a fine for possessing drugs, and you go to a mandatory meeting with an addictions counselor, your charges are dropped. And that's their move back to recriminalize because they were seeing deaths and disorder rising and public confidence falling in decrim. So it feels like governments are moving, as Ali says, to try to alter and continue, Jillian, the social buy-in, as the Premier puts it, the social buy-in for decriminalization needs to reassure people that they can still be safe in their public places, and the two aren't mutually exclusive, and that's why he's appealing the court decision.
For sure. And I think, this is legislation the government put in, they brought in, they felt was necessary. So it's no surprise that they're standing behind it. But it's, it's such a tough balance to strike because there is overwhelming evidence, and this is what the judge was ruling on, that many of the measures that we have to reduce public consumption of drugs actually increase the risk of death, whether that's confiscating drugs because that leads people to go seek out riskier supply. Putting them in the criminal justice system is not a pleasant experience that can cause trauma and harm and create mistrust. So, and pushing people behind closed doors, which is the number one thing that the coroner has said over and over again, is what's leading to these deaths. So it's a really, really tough balance to strike. I think the province really needs to not kind of be stuck in a reactive mode, and they really need to take leadership. If they're going to be pushing forward progressive policies, they really need to champion them and remind people that this is what the evidence is telling us, and that, yes, we have to do it in a managed way that addresses public safety concerns, that keeps streets safe as well. But they need to, show some leadership, some moral leadership, and really stand up for the evidence for what they're doing, and not kind of bow to pressure and sort of, chase the right-wing message down a rabbit hole.
Yeah, I really don't think it's about chasing the right-wing message. I think we're talking a lot about, the coroner being the champion of the evidence. Folks in communities have a lot of evidence with addiction. Everyone has experience of addiction in their lives and in their families and in their friends, and they've seen what long-term usage of hard drugs does to their loved ones and their health and their mental health and their relationships and their economic stability and their personal safety. And so, it's less about the random fears and chasing messages. It's about meeting people where they're at on these issues. And folks are really worried, safe injection sites is one thing. And I've just talked about why it's important that we have those to make it so that people have a safe place to go, so we can keep them alive if they get into treatment. But starting from a place of saying people are concerned about this because, they're chasing right-wing messages. No, it's because people have seen what this does to the lives of their loved ones, and they don't want these drugs getting into these folks' hand because it can destroy lives. And that's where we need to start, instead of pointing fingers and saying you're thinking wrong there.
Yeah, but you should also be able to say what you see and experience and feel and fear in your own community in terms of the impact that government policies are having on the streets.
Oh, yeah.
You should be able to say that without being labeled as a right-wing person who's subscribing to an ideology. We have NDP mayors saying that these policies are causing unintended consequences. You should be able to say that without being labeled on the political spectrum as an enemy of the NDP government, because they are moving their policies and gaslighting us at the same time by pretending they're not moving them. They have recriminalized decrim to a certain extent, but they won't say it. So we're all left kind of saying it, but being accused of having an ideology for saying it. And I think if they were more upfront about what Ali's point was, that it's okay to change your mind and alter the policies as you go to create good policy, we might not be labeling it on a political spectrum. But anyways, We spent the whole show talking about this one issue. Allie.
Rob, I just want to make one last point here because I think I need to connect the dots for some folks where when we think about this issue, we think that it's limited to the downtown east side. And we've said on this show before that it's not. And I want to bring awareness to that even more so in my point about treatment beds being all over the province. I just recently learned that 15 to 25-year-olds are the fastest growing group in Canada being hospitalized for opioid overdose. And those 15 to 25-year-olds are not all limited to the downtown east side. And so this is a massively larger issue beyond just this one little area with safe injection sites where you are able to get safe supply. And so when we think about it, your mind immediately goes to this one geographical area. It is not. And so we need to think about that as well.
Okay, we've completely out of time, but we have 1 minute. I'm going to give it to Jillian on new legislation the Premier's announced to define social media companies as contributing to public harm. Things like addiction and eating disorders and non-consensual image sharing, allowing the government maybe to sue these companies, similar to something we've seen in the States, Jillian, and you've been looking into that. Just quickly tell me what you think of that idea, what we should know about it.
Yeah, I think, BC's had some really disturbing stories of kids being affected by cyberbullying, by sextortion, I think is the term. And I think it's a great thing for the province to show leadership on. In the States, there's about, I think, 33 US states that are going after Meta in the courts, suing them for sort of negligently designing their algorithms in a way that's harmful to youth. And I think, the most important thing about this in BC is the province really showing leadership and sending a clear message to kids that if something happens to you through social media, it's not your fault. It's nothing to be ashamed of. And, it's something that we need to fight back on and talk about openly. And I think that that's really important leadership to be showing right now.
Mm-hmm. And, one of the criticisms government faces is, well, can they do anything in the face of giant tech giants on non-consensual image sharing and social media harm? Well, it's better to try than to do nothing. And I think that that this bill that they're bringing in is fascinating. You should subscribe to the podcast of the show because we have so much left to talk about on that as well. Great debate on the biggest issue of the week for sure, and continues to be the overdose crisis in British Columbia. Thank you to the panel. Thank you for watching. Make sure you subscribe, and we will see you next week with all the latest on BC politics here on Political Capital. Political Capital is brought to you by Uber Canada. Learn more at uber.com/flexibilityworks.